There are moments when something begins to move against you without ever revealing itself. No clear conflict, no visible threat, just subtle resistance, delay, or pressure that seems to operate outside your awareness. You may feel internally steady, yet notice that certain paths feel heavier, conversations feel strained, or progress feels interrupted without explanation. This is not inner fear. This is not restlessness. This is not something you created. Psalm 35 speaks to what operates quietly in opposition, not with noise or escalation, but with precision. It addresses what moves in the unseen while you remain grounded. This is not a call to fight. It is a moment of realignment. As this psalm unfolds, you are not asked to confront anything. You are not asked to respond. You are not asked to become alert or defensive. Defense is already active. What once moved with direction begins to lose coherence. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but steadily as alignment weakens and intention dissolves. As this space holds, allow your body to remain neutral. There is nothing to anticipate. What is being addressed does not require your participation. This is the point where interference begins to lose its path, quietly, deliberately, and without resistance. As this moment holds, the sense of opposition no longer feels personal. What once seemed directed at you begins to appear unfocused, misaligned, and unable to sustain its own movement. This shift is subtle but decisive. When direction weakens, pressure cannot remain effective. Psalm 35 does not work through confrontation. It works through displacement. What once had position begins to lose it. What once had alignment begins to scatter. You may notice that what felt persistent no longer holds the same weight, not because it vanished instantly, but because it no longer knows where to press. Direction was its strength. Without direction, effort dissolves. This is how interference ends, not through struggle, but through loss of coherence. As the words continue, there is no need to track what is changing. Tracking would imply responsibility. Responsibility is not yours here. The realignment happens without your attention, without your effort, without your participation. What once operated in the background begins to drift, not away dramatically, but off course. It no longer moves with intention. It no longer advances with clarity. Advancement requires alignment. Alignment has been interrupted. As this interruption deepens, the inner space remains untouched. This is important. The psalm does not pull you into the movement. It keeps you where you are while the movement happens elsewhere. You remain steady. What moves against you does not. This separation changes everything. When you are no longer inside the field of interference, its influence weakens naturally. It does not escalate. It does not adapt. It simply fails to reorganize. Failure here is quiet, unnoticed, final. As time passes, the sense of resistance begins to feel less intentional. What once felt targeted begins to feel random. Randomness cannot sustain pressure. Pressure requires purpose. Purpose has dissolved. Within this space, the nervous system does not activate. There is no signal to brace, no impulse to defend. Defense is already operating at a level that does not involve you. This is the essence of Psalm 35 in this moment, not fighting, but removal of alignment. What stands against you is no longer positioned to do so. As this continues, the external weight loses credibility. It no longer feels convincing. It no longer organizes perception. You may notice that situations that once felt heavy now feel neutral, unresolved, not because they demand attention, but because they no longer matter. Matter requires pressure. Pressure has lost direction. The space you occupy remains clear, unaffected and stable. Nothing enters it, nothing disturbs it. The movement happens around you, not within you. And as this block holds, the process continues, quietly dismantling what once moved with intention, leaving you untouched, steady and free from engagement. As this separation becomes more established, the contrast between where you are and what was moving against you becomes clearer without drawing attention to itself. You do not need to observe it closely. In fact, observation is unnecessary. What is happening does not depend on being witnessed. What once felt coordinated now begins to fragment, not violently, not suddenly, but through loss of internal agreement. Elements that once moved together no longer respond to one another. Signals weaken, timing collapses, momentum fails to renew itself. Psalm 35 operates precisely at this level. It does not attack presence, it dissolves coordination. When coordination dissolves, opposition cannot sustain direction. Without direction, effort becomes wasted movement. Wasted movement exhausts itself quietly. As this unfolds, you may notice that situations which once seemed to push back no longer carry the same authority. They still exist, but they do not influence. They do not set the tone. They do not define the space. Definition has shifted. Your internal space remains untouched by this unraveling. There is no pull toward reaction, no invitation to respond, no sense of needing to do something to keep the shift in place. This is important because when pressure cannot provoke response, it cannot regenerate itself. Reaction was its fuel. Fuel is no longer available. As time continues, what once felt persistent begins to feel distant, not in location but in relevance. It loses its ability to organize thought, emotion, or expectation. It becomes background noise without volume. Noise without volume fades naturally. Within this environment, the body remains neutral. There is no tightening in anticipation, no readiness waiting to return. The system recognizes that nothing is approaching, nothing is advancing. Advancement requires alignment. Alignment has not returned. As this lack of alignment stabilizes, even subtle forms of interference lose credibility. They no longer feel convincing enough to demand attention. They may appear briefly, but they do not carry weight. Weight was never inherent. It was given through response. Without response, influence dissipates. As the psalm continues, the process does not accelerate, it does not escalate. It simply continues, dismantling coordination where it once existed, piece by piece, without urgency, without resistance. You remain outside this process, not watching it, not directing it, simply unaffected by it. This is where Psalm 35 reveals its true function, not confrontation, but quiet removal of position. What once stood against you no longer stands anywhere. Standing requires support. Support has dissolved. As minutes pass, the sense of external pressure becomes increasingly abstract. It feels less like something acting and more like something ending. Endings here do not announce themselves, they simply stop continuing. Continuation has ended. What remains is not a surge of relief, but a steady absence of interference. Absence that feels natural. Absence that does not need explanation. The space you are in now does not need to be defended. It is not threatened. It is not challenged. The psalm has already shifted what needed to shift. And as this block holds, the quiet dismantling continues, reducing what once moved against you into irrelevance, leaving your inner space stable, undisturbed, and free from engagement. As this quiet dismantling continues, what once appeared to have intent no longer behaves as if it does. There is no longer a sense of opposition choosing its direction. Choice requires clarity. Clarity has dissolved. Without clarity, movement becomes erratic. Erratic movement cannot sustain pressure. It does not know where to press, how long to persist, or what to reinforce. It begins to expend itself without effect. Psalm 35 works precisely here, not by overpowering, but by allowing misalignment to complete its course. What once seemed to return repeatedly now fails to reassemble. Patterns lose their ability to repeat because repetition requires structure. Structure has collapsed quietly. As this happens, there is no internal signal calling you to remain attentive. Nothing is asking you to stay with it. The absence of instruction is intentional. What is unfolding does not require your presence. Presence would imply participation. Participation is not needed. Your inner space remains separate from this unraveling. You are not inside the movement. You are not affected by its attempts to reorganize. You remain in a position where nothing reaches you. This distinction is essential. When interference cannot reach the inner space, it loses its leverage entirely. It may still exist in fragments, but fragments do not coordinate. Without coordination, they dissolve into inactivity. Inactivity is the final stage. As minutes pass, even the memory of pressure begins to feel distant, not because it is suppressed, but because it no longer holds relevance. Relevance is what once kept it active. Without relevance, it fades naturally. The body responds to this by remaining steady without vigilance. There is no reflexive alertness waiting to return, no background tension scanning for signs. The system understands that nothing is approaching. Understanding at this level does not feel cognitive, it feels physical. The psalm continues, not adding intensity, but allowing the last remnants of alignment to dissolve. Nothing is forced, nothing is accelerated. The process completes itself at its own pace. Completion here does not announce itself, it simply stops continuing. As this block unfolds, the external environment loses its ability to shape the internal one. What happens around you no longer organizes what happens within you. Influence has been cut at the root. This is where Psalm 35 completes its work, not by confrontation, but by removal of position. What once moved against you no longer stands anywhere meaningful. Standing requires ground. Ground has disappeared. What remains is not emptiness, but clarity without pressure. A space where nothing presses, nothing demands, nothing advances. You do not need to hold this space. It holds itself. And as this moment continues, the quiet resolution remains in place, stable, unchallenged, and free from the need for response. As this resolution settles more fully, there is no sense of victory, no emotional release, no signal that something dramatic has occurred. What has happened is quieter than that. It feels like a background condition has changed, one that no longer supports interference of any kind. This is how true neutralization works. When something can no longer sustain itself, it does not fight to remain, it simply loses relevance. And when relevance disappears, attention naturally moves elsewhere without effort. What once required awareness now fails to register. Psalm 35 does not announce when this moment arrives. It does not mark completion. It allows the environment to change until opposition no longer recognizes itself as opposition. Recognition has ended. As this unfolds, the sense of separation between your inner space and the outer environment becomes effortless. There is no boundary to enforce, no barrier to maintain. The separation exists naturally because alignment has shifted permanently. This shift does not depend on time. It does not depend on vigilance. It does not depend on repetition. It holds on its own. You may notice that your inner responses feel slower, quieter, less reactive, not because you are trying to control them, but because there is nothing pressing against them. Without pressure, reaction has no role. Reaction always needed provocation. Provocation no longer reaches you. As this continues, even subtle forms of anticipation dissolve. There is no sense of waiting to see if something returns. Waiting implied uncertainty. Uncertainty has lost its footing. Certainty here is not belief, it is structural absence of threat. The psalm continues to operate beneath awareness, not adding force, but ensuring that what lost alignment does not regain it. This is not active defense, it is sustained displacement. Displacement does not announce itself, it remains effective quietly. As minutes pass, the external environment loses its ability to organize your inner rhythm. Situations may arise, conversations may occur, movement may happen, but none of it penetrates the space where your stability resides. Stability has relocated beyond reach. This is the condition Psalm 35 establishes when it completes its work. Not confrontation, but repositioning. Not conflict, but removal of access. Nothing is being held back. Nothing is being pushed away. Nothing is being monitored. What once moved against you has no path left to take. As this block holds, the experience does not move toward an ending. It settles into a state where continuation is unnecessary because nothing is active anymore. Activity has ceased. What remains is quiet authority, not as power, but as absence of vulnerability, absence that does not need to be maintained. This is the point where nothing more needs to happen, and yet the psalm continues, not to change anything further, but to ensure that what has settled remains settled, untouched by return, unaffected by time. As this state holds, there is no impulse to return to what once demanded attention. The system no longer looks back to check whether something might resume. That impulse belonged to a time when interference was still possible. Possibility has closed quietly. Closed does not mean sealed by force. It means no longer relevant. What once required effort to ignore no longer appears clearly enough to be noticed. It fades from perception, not because it is hidden, but because it no longer carries weight. Weight was what made it visible. Visibility has ended. As minutes pass, the inner world remains unaffected by external variation. Sounds, thoughts, or moments of movement do not alter the background stability. Nothing shifts the internal balance because nothing is pressing against it. Pressure has no leverage here. This is where Psalm 35 completes its deeper work, not by creating a new state, but by restoring a natural one, a state where interference cannot organize itself around you. Organization required access. Access has been removed. As this continues, the body remains neutral and unguarded. There is no readiness beneath the surface, no subtle tension waiting for instruction. The system no longer prepares for what it does not expect. Expectation has dissolved. Without expectation, rest becomes uninterrupted. Even alertness, when it appears, feels calm and grounded. There is no urgency attached to it. Urgency depended on threat. Threat no longer registers. The psalm continues to move beneath awareness, not repeating itself, not reinforcing itself, but maintaining the condition that has already been established. Maintenance here is passive. It does not require effort or attention. This is important to understand, because what does not require attention does not collapse when attention moves away. As the space holds, you may notice that your internal rhythm feels more consistent. Moments feel less reactive. Thoughts feel less directive. Decisions, when they arise, feel simpler. Simplicity emerges when interference leaves. This simplicity does not announce itself as clarity. It simply removes complication. What remains feels obvious, natural, and stable. As time moves forward, there is no sense of needing to stay with the words. The words exist only as accompaniment. They are not carrying the process. The process is already complete in its essential movement. What remains now is continuity. Continuity does not ask to be prolonged. It simply remains until it is no longer needed to be noticed. And as this block continues, everything stays exactly where it should be, unchallenged, unpressured, and free from the need to respond. As this state continues to settle, what once felt external no longer feels present enough to be tracked. There is no longer a sense of something operating nearby, not because it was pushed away, but because it no longer finds a position from which to operate. Position was everything. When position is lost, influence cannot reorganize itself. It may attempt to return in fragments, but fragments do not coordinate. Without coordination, nothing advances. Psalm 35 functions precisely at this level, not interrupting movement, but dissolving the ground that movement depended on. As this happens, you may notice that your inner responses feel increasingly simple. There is less internal commentary, less evaluation, less need to interpret what you're sensing. Interpretation was once necessary because pressure demanded meaning. Meaning no longer forms. The body mirrors this shift by remaining unguarded. There is no subtle bracing beneath the surface, no background alertness scanning for return. The system understands, without thought, that nothing is approaching. Understanding at this level does not feel mental, it feels structural. As minutes pass, the sense of separation between your inner space and the outer environment becomes effortless. You are not maintaining distance. Distance exists naturally because alignment has changed. What once aligned against you no longer aligns at all. This is where Psalm 35 moves from neutralization into permanence, not by reinforcing itself, but by ensuring that what lost coherence does not regain it. Regaining would require access. Access is closed. As this closure holds, even subtle emotional echoes lose their relevance. They may appear briefly, but they do not attach. They pass through without leaving residue. Residue was what once carried influence forward. Without residue, nothing repeats. The experience continues without asking for attention. You do not need to remain focused. You do not need to stay engaged. What has shifted remains in place regardless of where attention moves. This is important for what comes next, because when nothing depends on vigilance, true rest becomes possible, even while awareness remains present. There's no waiting for confirmation, no checking whether the change will hold. It already holds. As this block continues, the outer world no longer organizes the inner rhythm. Situations may still exist, movement may still occur, but none of it enters the space where stability resides. Stability has relocated beyond reach, and as this relocation settles, there is nothing left for interference to work with. No signal to amplify, no reaction to provoke, no alignment to exploit. What remains is quiet clarity, not as insight, but as absence of pressure. This absence does not need to be protected. It protects itself. As this stability holds, there is no longer any movement left to observe. What needed to lose position has already done so. Nothing remains active enough to require attention. This is the moment where continuation becomes effortless, not because something new is happening, but because nothing needs to happen anymore. And in this space, there is a quiet understanding that this environment is not temporary. If this space has become a place where you can remain without pressure, without interference, and without vigilance, you are welcome to stay connected to this channel. Remaining here is simply a way to return to this state whenever you need clarity, stability, or quiet protection. Nothing changes after this invitation. The rhythm does not shift. The atmosphere remains intact. The state does not react. True alignment is not interrupted by recognition. As the words continue, there is no sense of closure approaching. The experience does not move toward an ending. It settles into a condition where nothing further is required. Psalm 35 has already completed its work, not by confrontation, but by removing alignment. What once moved against you no longer has direction, access, or ground. There is nothing left to engage. As this settles, the inner space remains clear and unguarded. No effort is needed to maintain it. No attention is required to protect it. It remains stable whether you are aware of it or not. This is what permanence feels like. The outer world may continue to move, but it no longer organizes your inner rhythm. Situations may arise, but they do not press inward. The separation is complete and effortless. As the sound continues or softens or fades, nothing essential changes. The condition that has been established does not depend on words. It carries forward quietly into the next moments, into rest, into silence. There is nothing else to resolve, nothing else to prepare for, nothing else to hold. What remains now is simple, stable, and uninterrupted, free from interference, free from pressure, and free from the need to respond. As the minutes continue, there is no change in intensity because nothing here depends on momentum. What has settled does not require time to strengthen. It remains equally present whether moments pass quickly or slowly. This is how permanence reveals itself. The inner space does not contract as sound softens. It does not open or close. It simply remains available, unaffected by what comes and goes. Thoughts may pass through, sensations may arise. None of them alter what has already been established. Nothing presses inward. Nothing reorganizes itself against you. The absence of pressure is not something you need to notice in order for it to remain true. It continues beneath awareness, shaping how everything else is received without effort. As this quiet state holds, the nervous system no longer prepares for return. There is no subtle readiness waiting beneath the surface. Readiness belonged to a different environment. That environment no longer exists here. The psalm has done what it needed to do, not by creating movement, but by ensuring that movement cannot reform. What once attempted to align has lost its reference. Without reference, nothing advances. Advancement requires direction. Direction is gone. This is why nothing more needs to happen now. There is no next step, no final action, no closing declaration. The process does not complete by ending, it completes by remaining stable. Stability here is not fragile, it is indifferent to time. As sound continues or gradually becomes less noticeable, the state does not thin, it does not loosen, it does not fade with attention. It remains active beneath rest, beneath silence, beneath stillness. If sleep comes, it does not interrupt this space. If awareness drifts, it does not weaken it. If the words end, nothing essential changes. This is not a moment to hold on to. It is a condition you can return to naturally. Nothing calls you back to vigilance. Nothing asks you to remain alert. Nothing invites response. What once needed attention no longer exists in a form that requires it. And so the space remains. Unpressured, undisturbed, unreachable by interference. There is nothing left to resolve, nothing left to secure, nothing left to guard. The sound may continue for a few moments more, or it may soften into quiet. Either way, what has settled remains exactly as it is, stable, protected, and beyond reach. As this quiet condition remains, there is no awareness of holding anything in place. What has settled does not require maintenance. It does not depend on repetition, attention, or reinforcement. It exists independently of awareness. This independence is what makes it reliable. The inner space no longer reacts to silence. Silence does not feel empty or anticipatory. It feels complete. Nothing is missing from it. Nothing is expected to arrive. Expectation has no role here. As moments pass, there is no internal signal urging transition. The experience does not move toward a next phase. It does not lean forward or pull backward. It stays exactly where it is, untouched by time. Time no longer organizes the inner rhythm. Breathing continues naturally, without instruction. The body remains neutral, neither braced nor released, simply present. There is no impulse to check how it feels. Checking would imply uncertainty. Uncertainty has no footing here. The psalm continues beneath awareness, not as sound, but as condition. A condition where nothing external organizes the inner state and nothing unseen finds alignment. Alignment does not return. As the sound remains or softens or gradually becomes less noticeable, the state holds the same quiet clarity. It does not thin at the edges. It does not dissolve when attention drifts. It does not intensify when attention returns. It remains constant. This constancy allows rest to deepen without effort, not as collapse, not as withdrawal, but as presence without demand. Presence that does not need to be monitored. Nothing presses inward. Nothing advances. Nothing reorganizes itself against you. What once attempted to influence no longer finds access, direction, or ground. It does not return in another form. It does not adapt. It simply remains inactive. Inactivity here is final. There is no reason to remain alert, no reason to prepare, no reason to engage. The space you are in now is not temporary. It is available whenever stillness is allowed. It does not depend on the sound continuing. It does not depend on awareness staying present. It remains beyond both. As these final moments pass, nothing closes, nothing resolves, nothing ends. The sound may continue briefly, or it may fade. Either way, the condition remains unchanged, quiet, stable, and untouched by interference. And so everything stays exactly as it should be. As the sound reaches its natural end, nothing else is required. There is no instruction to follow, no action to take, no awareness to maintain. What needed to settle has already done so. This space does not depend on continuation. It does not depend on sound. It does not depend on attention. It remains active beyond the words. The quiet clarity that has formed does not dissolve when the audio fades. It carries forward into silence, into rest, into whatever comes next. Nothing reopens. Nothing returns. What once moved against you no longer has direction. What once pressed no longer finds access. What once demanded response no longer registers. There is no need to remain alert, no need to watch for change, no need to guard what has already stabilized. Psalm 35 does not end with a declaration. It leaves you exactly where you are, unpressured, undisturbed, and outside the reach of interference. As the sound fades, allow everything to remain as it is. There is nothing to conclude, nothing to resolve, nothing to close. The space remains, quiet, clear, unaffected, and whatever comes next will meet you from here, steady, protected, and free from engagement.